In the bustling heart of Atlanta, Georgia, a city steeped in civil rights history, an incident unfolded that would shake the foundations of law enforcement and reignite discussions about racial prejudice in America. It was a warm summer afternoon when 68-year-old Evelyn Washington, a distinguished retired FBI agent with decades of service to her country, found herself at the center of a confrontation that would expose the deep-seated issues still plaguing the nation. Evelyn, a petite woman with silver hair and kind eyes that sparkled with wisdom, had dedicated her life to justice. Even in retirement, she remained active in her community, volunteering at local youth centers and participating in civil rights organizations. On this fateful day, she was heading to a meeting with local leaders to discuss initiatives for improving police-community relations, an irony that would soon become painfully apparent. As Evelyn walked down Peachtree Street, her mind preoccupied with the upcoming meeting, she was unaware of the eyes watching her. Officer Derek Thompson, a 35-year-old patrol officer with the Atlanta Police Department, observed Evelyn from his cruiser. Thompson, known among his colleagues for his quick temper and questionable views on race, had been the subject of several internal investigations, though none had resulted in serious consequences. Thompson's attention was drawn to Evelyn not because of any suspicious behavior, but simply because of the color of her skin. In his mind, shaped by years of unchecked biases and a culture that often turned a blind eye to discrimination, an elderly black woman in this predominantly white business district was out of place. Without a second thought, he decided to approach her. The officer exited his vehicle, his hand resting casually on his holster, a posture that immediately set the tone for the interaction. Evelyn, sensing someone approaching, turned to face Thompson. Her years of FBI training kicked in, and she quickly assessed the situation, noting the officer's tense body language and the hint of disdain in his eyes. Thompson demanded to see Evelyn's identification, his voice harsh and accusatory. Evelyn, maintaining her composure, calmly asked why she was being stopped. This simple question seemed to infuriate Thompson, who interpreted it as a challenge to his authority. His face reddened, and his voice rose as he repeated his demand, now laced with thinly veiled racial slurs. Passers-by began to take notice of the confrontation. Some slowed their pace, watching with a mix of curiosity and concern. Others quickened their steps, not wanting to get involved. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something was amiss and feeling compelled to document the interaction. Evelyn, drawing on her years of experience in law enforcement, attempted to de-escalate the situation. She spoke softly, explaining that she was on her way to a community meeting and offering to show her identification. But Thompson was beyond reason. In his mind, Evelyn's calm demeanor was a sign of disrespect, a refusal to submit to his authority. What happened next would be replayed on news channels and social media platforms across the country. In a moment of uncontrolled rage, Thompson lashed out, his fist connecting with Evelyn's face. The sound of the impact seemed to echo down the street, followed by a collective gasp from the onlookers. Evelyn staggered back, more shocked than hurt. In all her years of service, facing down dangerous criminals and navigating tense situations, she had never experienced such a blatant abuse of power. As she steadied herself, she felt a trickle of blood from her split lip, a physical manifestation of the pain and indignity she was experiencing. The crowd that had gathered erupted in outrage. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the air. Several people rushed forward to help Evelyn, while others confronted Thompson, demanding his badge number and threatening to report him. The officer, suddenly realizing the gravity of his actions, attempted to regain control of the situation by calling for backup. Within minutes, the scene was flooded with police cars, their sirens piercing the air and adding to the chaos. Among the arriving officers was Captain Sarah Martinez, Thompson's direct superior. Martinez, a veteran officer known for her integrity and commitment to community policing, took in the scene with a mix of horror and disappointment. As Martinez approached, Evelyn straightened herself, wiping the blood from her lip. With dignity and composure that belied the assault she had just endured, she introduced herself to the captain, revealing her identity as a retired FBI agent. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered officers and onlookers alike. Martinez's face paled as she realized the full implications of the situation. Not only had one of her officers assaulted an innocent civilian, but that civilian was a highly respected former federal agent. The potential fallout from this incident would be enormous, threatening to undo years of work in community relations and possibly leading to a federal investigation. Thompson, upon hearing Evelyn's identity, visibly deflated. The bravado and anger that had fueled his actions moments ago evaporated, replaced by a dawning realization of the trouble he was in. He attempted to stammer out an explanation, but his words fell flat in the face of the evidence and witness accounts. As the situation unfolded, news crews began to arrive, drawn by the commotion and alerted by social media posts from witnesses. The incident was quickly becoming a major story, one that would dominate headlines and spark intense debates about police brutality and racial profiling. Evelyn, despite the pain and humiliation she had endured, remained remarkably composed. She spoke briefly with Captain Martinez, providing her contact information and expressing her willingness to cooperate with any investigation. However, she also made it clear that she would be pursuing all legal avenues to address this egregious violation of her rights. As Evelyn was escorted to an ambulance for medical evaluation, the crowd's anger continued to grow. The incident had struck a nerve, bringing to the surface long-simmering tensions between the police and the Black community in Atlanta. Chants for justice began to rise, and there was a palpable sense that this could be the spark that ignited larger protests. In the days that followed, the incident became a national sensation. Video footage captured by bystanders went viral, showing the unprovoked attack in vivid, undeniable detail. News anchors and political pundits debated the implications, while civil rights leaders called for sweeping reforms in police departments across the country. Evelyn Washington, once content to enjoy a quiet retirement, found herself thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of injustice. Her background as an FBI agent added an extra layer of complexity to the narrative, challenging stereotypes and forcing many to confront their own biases. The Atlanta Police Department faced intense scrutiny. Questions arose about their hiring practices, training procedures, and mechanisms for accountability. How had an officer like Thompson, with his history of complaints, been allowed to remain on the force? What systemic failures had led to this moment? Officer Derek Thompson was immediately suspended pending an investigation. As details of his past behavior came to light, including racially charged comments to colleagues and a pattern of aggressive behavior towards minorities, public outrage intensified. Calls for his arrest and prosecution grew louder with each passing day. For Evelyn, the aftermath of the incident was a whirlwind of medical appointments, legal consultations, and media requests. Despite the physical and emotional toll, she remained committed to using her experience as a catalyst for change. She began speaking out about the need for police reform, drawing on her unique perspective as both a victim of racial profiling and a former law enforcement professional. The incident sparked a series of town hall meetings across Atlanta, bringing together community members, police officials, and local politicians. Evelyn was often invited to speak, her words carrying weight due to her experiences on both sides of the law enforcement divide. She emphasized the need for better training, more diverse hiring practices, and stronger accountability measures for officers who abuse their power. As weeks turned into months, the legal proceedings against Officer Thompson moved forward. The district attorney, under immense public pressure, brought charges of assault and civil rights violations. The trial became a focal point for discussions about race and policing in America, with every detail scrutinized by the media and the public. Throughout this period, Evelyn worked tirelessly to channel the energy surrounding her case into positive change. She collaborated with civil rights organizations to develop new training programs for police officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias recognition. Her efforts began to gain traction, with several police departments across the country expressing interest in implementing her recommendations. The incident also had ripple effects within the FBI. Evelyn's former colleagues, outraged by the attack on one of their own, began internal discussions about how the Bureau could play a more active role in addressing systemic racism in local law enforcement. Task forces were formed to investigate patterns of abuse and to provide support to reform-minded police departments. As the trial date approached, tensions in Atlanta remained high. Community organizers planned rallies and marches to coincide with key dates in the legal proceedings. City officials, wary of potential unrest, increased security measures while also making public commitments to address the underlying issues that had led to the incident. The trial itself was a media spectacle. Each day, the courthouse was surrounded by protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers. Inside, the prosecution presented a compelling case, bolstered by video evidence and testimony from eyewitnesses. Thompson's defense team attempted to portray the incident as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than a reflection of deep-seated racial bias, but their arguments seemed hollow in the face of the evidence. Evelyn took the stand during the trial, her testimony powerful and moving. She spoke not only about the physical assault, but about the emotional impact of being treated as a suspect, simply because of her race. Her words resonated with many who had experienced similar treatment, while also opening the eyes of those who had never faced such discrimination. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the outcome would have implications far beyond the fate of one officer. It was seen as a referendum on police accountability and the justice system's ability to address racial bias. The nation watched with bated breath as the jury deliberated. After several days of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Officer Derek Thompson was found guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and for some, a sense that justice had been served. Evelyn, seated in the front row, closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The sentencing phase brought another wave of media attention. Character witnesses spoke about Thompson's past behavior, revealing a pattern of racial bias that had gone unchecked for years. In the end, the judge handed down a substantial prison sentence, citing the need to send a strong message about the consequences of abusing police power. In the aftermath of the trial, Atlanta became ground zero for a national conversation about police reform. The city's leadership, under intense pressure from the public and civil rights organizations, committed to a series of sweeping changes. These included mandatory bias training for all officers, the establishment of an independent review board for police misconduct, and increased funding for community policing initiatives. Evelyn Washington, now a reluctant but powerful voice in the movement for police reform, continued to speak out and work towards change. She established a foundation dedicated to promoting understanding between law enforcement and minority communities, focusing particularly on programs that brought young people and police officers together in non-confrontational settings. The incident also sparked a renewed interest in addressing racial bias within the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies. Evelyn was invited to consult on new training programs and policies aimed at ensuring that federal agents were better equipped to recognize and combat systemic racism, both within their own ranks and in their interactions with local law enforcement. As months turned into years, the effects of that fateful day on Peachtree Street continued to ripple outward. Police departments across the country began to reevaluate their practices, many adopting reforms similar to those implemented in Atlanta. The conversation about race and policing in America, once relegated to the margins, became a central issue in political debates and policy discussions. For Evelyn personally, the journey was one of healing and purpose. The physical wounds from the assault had long since healed, but the emotional impact lingered. She found solace in her work, knowing that her experience was helping to drive real change. Her story became a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The incident on Peachtree Street, while traumatic, had become a catalyst for long overdue reforms. It served as a stark reminder of the work still to be done in addressing racial bias in law enforcement and society at large. But it also demonstrated the power of individuals to effect change, even in the face of deeply entrenched systems of oppression. As Atlanta and the nation continued to grapple with issues of race and policing, Evelyn Washington's legacy grew. She became a symbol of dignity and perseverance, her story taught in schools and police academies alike as an example of the consequences of unchecked bias and the importance of treating all individuals with respect and equality. The changes sparked by that single moment of violence were far-reaching and ongoing. Police departments across the country began to adopt more stringent hiring practices, weeding out candidates with histories of racial bias or excessive use of force. Training programs were overhauled to place greater emphasis on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Community oversight boards were established in many cities, giving residents a greater voice in how their neighborhoods were policed. In the political arena, the incident became a rallying point for those pushing for comprehensive criminal justice reform. Legislators at both the state and federal levels introduced bills aimed at increasing police accountability and addressing systemic racism in the justice system. While progress was often slow and met with resistance, the momentum for change continued to build. The media landscape also evolved in the wake of the incident. News organizations began to pay more attention to stories of police misconduct, particularly those with racial overtones. Investigative journalists dug deep into police departments across the country, uncovering patterns of abuse and discrimination that had long gone unreported. This increased scrutiny helped to keep the issue of police reform in the public eye and maintained pressure on officials to enact meaningful changes. Within the Black community, the incident sparked a renewed sense of activism and engagement. Young people, in particular, were inspired by Evelyn's story and her subsequent work. Many were motivated to pursue careers in law enforcement or public policy, determined to change the system from within. Community organizations focused on police accountability and civil rights saw a surge in volunteers and donations, enabling them to expand their outreach and advocacy efforts. The tech industry also played a role in the changes that followed. Inspired by the video evidence that had been crucial in Evelyn's case, developers created new apps designed to help citizens safely document interactions with police. These tools became widely adopted, serving as both a deterrent to misconduct and a means of holding officers accountable for their actions. As the years passed, the incident on Peachtree Street became a touchstone in discussions about race and policing in America. It was referenced in academic studies, cited in court cases, and used as a case study in police training programs. The image of Evelyn Washington, dignified and determined in the face of injustice, became iconic, a powerful reminder of both how far society had come and how much work remained to be done. For Evelyn herself, the journey continued. Though she had never sought the spotlight, she embraced her role as an advocate for change. She traveled the country, speaking at conferences, universities, and police academies. Her message was always one of hope, tempered with realism, acknowledging the deep-rooted nature of racial bias, while also emphasizing the potential for positive change through education, accountability, and persistent effort. As she aged, Evelyn began to focus on ensuring that her work would continue beyond her lifetime. She established mentorship programs for young activists and aspiring law enforcement officers, sharing her wisdom and experience with the next generation of leaders. Her foundation expanded its reach, funding research into best practices for community policing and supporting initiatives aimed at building trust between law enforcement and minority communities. The impact of Evelyn's work became evident in subtle but significant ways. In cities where her programs had been implemented, there were measurable decreases in use of force incidents and citizen complaints against police. More importantly, there were signs of improved relationships between police departments and the communities they served. While progress was not uniform and challenges remained, there was a sense that real change was possible. As Evelyn Washington entered her twilight years, she could look back on a life that had come full circle. From a young FBI agent fighting for justice to a retired citizen assaulted by the very system she had served, and finally to a revered advocate for reform, her journey embodied the complex and ongoing struggle for racial equality in America. Her legacy was not just in the changes she had helped to bring about, but in the countless individuals she had inspired to continue the work of building a more just and equitable society. The incident on Peachtree Street, born of hatred and bias, had ultimately become a force for positive change. It served as a powerful reminder of the impact that a single moment and a single individual's response to that moment can have on the course of history. As America continued to wrestle with issues of race and justice, the story of Evelyn Washington remained a beacon of hope and a call to action for all those committed to the ideals of equality and justice for all. Yet, the story of Evelyn Washington and the changes she inspired was not without its challenges and setbacks. As with any significant social movement, there was pushback from those who felt threatened by the call for reform. Police unions in some cities resisted changes to disciplinary procedures and oversight mechanisms, arguing that such reforms would make it difficult for officers to do their jobs effectively. Conservative politicians and media figures often framed the discussion around police reform as an attack on law enforcement as a whole, rather than an effort to address specific issues of racial bias and excessive use of force. This rhetoric sometimes resonated with segments of the public who feared that reform efforts would lead to increased crime rates. Despite these obstacles, Evelyn and her supporters continued to push forward, adapting their strategies to address new challenges as they arose. They recognized that lasting change would require not just policy reforms, but a fundamental shift in cultural attitudes and institutional practices. One of the key initiatives that emerged from Evelyn's foundation was a comprehensive education program aimed at fostering empathy and understanding between law enforcement and minority communities. The program, named Bridges of Trust, brought together police officers and community members for a series of workshops and immersive experiences designed to break down stereotypes and build meaningful relationships. In Atlanta, where the program was first piloted, the results were promising. Officers who participated reported a greater understanding of the communities they served, while residents expressed increased trust in local law enforcement. The success of Bridges of Trust led to its adoption in cities across the country, from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York. As the program expanded, Evelyn worked tirelessly to ensure its integrity and effectiveness. She personally oversaw the training of facilitators and regularly attended sessions to gauge their impact. Her presence, even as she entered her 80s, continued to inspire both officers and community members alike. The media, which had initially focused on the sensational aspects of Evelyn's assault, began to take a deeper interest in her ongoing work. Documentaries were produced chronicling her journey from FBI agent to civil rights advocate. These films not only highlighted the progress that had been made, but also shed light on the persistent challenges facing communities of color in their interactions with law enforcement. One such documentary, titled The Long Arc, followed Evelyn as she returned to her hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. The film juxtaposed her childhood memories of the civil rights movement with the current state of police-community relations in the city. It was a poignant reminder of how far the nation had come, and yet how much work remained to be done. The film also captured a powerful moment when Evelyn met with the family of a young man who had been killed in a controversial police shooting. Her ability to connect with their pain while also offering hope for a better future moved viewers across the country and reignited conversations about the need for continued reform. As Evelyn's work gained national recognition, it also attracted the attention of policymakers at the highest levels of government. She was invited to testify before Congress on the issue of police reform, an opportunity she used to advocate for federal legislation that would standardize training requirements and accountability measures across all law enforcement agencies. Her testimony was compelling, drawing on both her personal experience and the data collected through her foundation's research. She spoke of the need for a national database to track officer misconduct, increased funding for community policing initiatives, and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. The response to Evelyn's congressional appearance was overwhelming. Social media buzzed with clips of her testimony, and editorial pages across the country praised her measured yet forceful call for change. Even those who had previously been skeptical of reform efforts found it difficult to argue with the reasoned approach presented by this dignified former FBI agent. In the wake of her testimony, a bipartisan group of lawmakers began work on what would come to be known as the Washington Act, named in Evelyn's honor. The proposed legislation incorporated many of her recommendations and represented the most comprehensive federal effort to address police reform in decades. As debate over the Washington Act heated up, Evelyn found herself once again at the center of a national conversation. She gave interviews, wrote op-eds, and continued to speak at events across the country, always emphasizing the importance of bringing all stakeholders to the table in the pursuit of meaningful change. The legislative battle was long and contentious, with powerful interests on both sides lobbying intensely. Evelyn watched the process unfold with a mixture of hope and frustration, knowing that the outcome would have far-reaching implications for communities across the nation. After months of negotiation and revision, the Washington Act finally came to a vote. The nation held its breath as the final tallies were counted. In a moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts for years to come, the bill passed by a narrow margin, representing a major victory for Evelyn and her allies in the reform movement. The passage of the Washington Act was a watershed moment, but Evelyn knew that legislation alone would not solve the deep-seated issues at the heart of police-community relations. As the new law began to be implemented across the country, she turned her attention to ensuring that its provisions were properly enforced and that local departments had the resources they needed to enact meaningful change. This next phase of work brought new challenges. Some departments embraced the reforms wholeheartedly, eager to improve their relationships with the communities they served. Others dragged their feet, implementing changes slowly or finding ways to circumvent the spirit of the law while adhering to its letter. Evelyn and her team worked tirelessly to monitor implementation, providing support where it was needed and calling out departments that failed to meet the new standards. They developed a rating system for police departments, publishing annual reports that highlighted both progress and areas of concern. These reports became a valuable tool for community activists and local governments alike. Cities with high-performing departments used their ratings as a point of pride, while those with poor scores faced increased pressure to improve. The transparency fostered by this system helped to drive continuous improvement and accountability. As the years passed, the impact of Evelyn's work became increasingly clear. Statistics showed a gradual but steady decline in use of force incidents and civilian complaints against police. More importantly, surveys indicated growing trust between law enforcement and minority communities in many cities across the country. But even as progress was made, new challenges emerged. The rise of social media and ubiquitous camera phones meant that incidents of police misconduct, when they did occur, were more likely than ever to be captured and shared widely. While this increased transparency was generally seen as positive, it also meant that tensions could flare quickly in response to viral videos, sometimes before all the facts were known. Evelyn found herself increasingly called upon to be a voice of reason in these moments of crisis. She urged patience and thorough investigation while also acknowledging the very real pain and anger that such incidents provoked. Her ability to empathize with all sides while still pushing for accountability made her a trusted figure for both law enforcement and community leaders. As she entered her 90s, Evelyn began to step back from the day-to-day operations of her foundation, focusing instead on mentoring the next generation of leaders in the police reform movement. She took particular interest in young people from diverse backgrounds who were pursuing careers in law enforcement, seeing in them the potential to drive change from within the system. One of these young leaders was Marcus Johnson, a former community organizer who had been inspired by Evelyn's story to become a police officer. Under her mentorship, Marcus rose through the ranks to become one of the youngest police chiefs in the country, implementing innovative community policing strategies in his department. Evelyn's relationship with Marcus was just one example of the lasting impact of her work. Across the country, there were countless individuals whose lives had been touched by her efforts, from officers who had undergone transformative training to community members who felt safer and more respected in their interactions with police. As Evelyn's 100th birthday approached, plans were made for a national celebration of her life and work. The event was to be held in Atlanta, where her journey as an advocate had begun all those years ago on Peachtree Street. Invitations were sent to leaders from across the political spectrum, as well as to community activists, law enforcement officials, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been impacted by her work. In the days leading up to the celebration, reflections on Evelyn's legacy dominated the media. Commentators marveled at the arc of her life, from the Jim Crow era of her youth to the present day. Many noted that while significant progress had been made, the work she had started was far from finished. The day of the celebration dawned bright and clear. Crowds gathered early outside the venue, a mix of well-wishers and protesters. Some carried signs thanking Evelyn for her work, while others used the occasion to call attention to ongoing issues of racial injustice. Inside, the atmosphere was one of reverence and gratitude. Speakers from all walks of life shared stories of how Evelyn had influenced them, from the highest-ranking government officials to everyday citizens. A common theme emerged. Evelyn Washington had not only changed policies and practices, but she had also changed hearts and minds. As the guest of honor took the stage, leaning slightly on a cane, but still radiating the dignity and determination that had defined her life, the audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Evelyn waited patiently for the applause to die down, her eyes scanning the crowd, taking in the diverse faces that represented the America she had fought so hard to build. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of a century of experience. She reflected on the long journey from that day on Peachtree Street to the present moment, acknowledging both the progress that had been made and the challenges that remained. She spoke of her hope for the future, her belief in the power of individuals to effect change, and her conviction that the arc of history, though long, bends towards justice. As she concluded her remarks, Evelyn issued a challenge to all those present and to the nation as a whole. The work of building a just and equitable society, she reminded them, was never finished. It required constant vigilance, ongoing effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. She called on each person to commit themselves anew to this work, to carry forward the torch of justice and equality for future generations. The celebration of Evelyn Washington's life and work was more than just a tribute to one remarkable woman. It was a moment of national reflection, a chance to take stock of how far the country had come in addressing issues of racial bias in law enforcement and how far it still had to go. As the event concluded and people filed out into the Atlanta streets, there was a palpable sense of renewed commitment to the ideals Evelyn had championed for so long. In the days and weeks that followed, the impact of the celebration reverberated across the nation. Police departments reported a surge in applications from minority candidates inspired by Evelyn's story. Community organizations saw an uptick in volunteerism and engagement. Politicians from both sides of the aisle found common ground in their support for continued reform efforts. For Evelyn herself, the celebration marked the beginning of a new chapter. Though her public appearances became less frequent in the years that followed, her influence continued to be felt. She devoted her remaining energy to writing her memoirs, determined to ensure that the lessons of her long life would be preserved for future generations. The book, when it was finally published, became an instant bestseller. It was more than just a personal story. It was a chronicle of America's ongoing struggle with issues of race and justice, told through the eyes of a woman who had witnessed and shaped nearly a century of that history. Evelyn's memoirs sparked a renewed national conversation about the role of law enforcement in society and the ongoing work of building trust between police and the communities they serve. Book clubs across the country discussed her experiences, schools incorporated her story into their curricula, and a new generation of activists found inspiration in her words. As Evelyn Washington's long and impactful life drew to a close, the nation paused once again to reflect on her legacy. The changes she had set in motion continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways both large and small. From the halls of power in Washington, D.C., to the streets of cities and towns across America, her influence could be seen in the ongoing efforts to create a more just and equitable society. The story of Evelyn Washington, from the violent confrontation on Peachtree Street to her transformative work in police reform, had become woven into the fabric of American history. It served as a powerful reminder of the potential for positive change, even in the face of deeply entrenched systems of oppression. More importantly, it stood as a call to action, challenging each new generation to take up the mantle of justice and equality. As the nation mourned Evelyn's passing, there was a collective recognition that the best way to honor her memory was to continue the work she had started. In police academies and community centers, in courtrooms and classrooms, her spirit lived on in the ongoing efforts to build a society where every individual, regardless of race or background, could feel safe, respected, and valued. The long journey that began with a single act of violence on Atlanta Street had transformed not just one life, but an entire nation. Evelyn Washington's legacy was not just in the laws and policies she had helped to shape, but in the countless lives she had touched and the enduring hope she had instilled in the American people. As the country moved forward, facing new challenges and opportunities, the example of Evelyn Washington continued to light the way towards a more just and equitable future for all.